Welcome, everybody. If you can please take your seats. Okay, we appreciate you coming out, trekking up the hill a little bit, good exercise to start the day. And I'd like to welcome you from all of our planning partners for this event: Pacifica's Climate Committee, Pacifica's Environmental Family, Pacifica Historical Society, and the Pedro Point Community Association. We have some members of our City of Pacifica City Council here this afternoon: Mayor Sue Vaterlos, Council members Beckmeyer, Bowles, and I'm not sure if we've seen Beer yet. But welcome. We're delighted that they're here, and we're really excited to be able to bring this program to the community. With the great interest in this program, you'll see that we are having it recorded by our local community television station, Pacific Coast TV. So we're very happy that they are here with us so that we can share this afterwards and you can watch it again. We have a full program today. So at this time, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Nancy Tierney with the Pacifica Climate Committee.
Hi, good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing Kata Gomes, who's a descendant of Ramaytush Ohlone and Temictac. Some of you have heard Kata speak in the city, giving us very compelling words, and she would like to welcome you today. Kata?
Hersha Puhi, Ekrakat Kata Gomes, Kanak Ramaytush, Salilian, Saklan at Spanish. Horsha Tamuate Makrua, Tunet Kai Umu, and it's Aramai. Shishpanane Kam Watekne. And I just spoke to you in our Ramaytush language. I recently, 2 years ago, started studying it with Breath of Life Indigenous Language Program in Berkeley. We hadn't had any native speakers in over 100 years. And as of a year ago, this March, Muchiate Indigenous Land Trust has employed 2 linguists to work with us, and we're very proud. March 16th, we're celebrating our 1-year anniversary of our Ramaytush Language School being held weekly in Moss Beach. So for many of you, this is probably the first time that you're hearing the Ramaytush language, and we're very happy to be doing this cultural revitalization work. I'd like to acknowledge my ancestors. Here, my Ramaytush ancestors were originally from the village of Temictac along Calera Creek here in Pacifica. Muchiate, that our nonprofit is named after, is the matriarch of our family. She's documented at Mission Dolores in 1782. Not only did they document our family's indigenous names, which is very rare, but also mention our village site of Temictac along Calera Creek. I'd like to acknowledge our ancestors here on our unceded ancestral homeland. Unceded meaning there was never any compensation given for the land, so it essentially is stolen land. And I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors for the traumas that they endured and survived and made it possible for myself and my relatives to even exist here today. I'd like to share a song with you. It was an assignment in our class to write a song, a poem, or a story in our Ramaytush language. And this was several months ago. I started to write a song and I hadn't really fully completed it. But I worked on it for this event because it seems so fitting. The title of the song is Tunet Kai Umu, which translates to at the edge of the ocean. And so I'll share that with you right now. This is our traditional instrument that we used, along with rattles and whistles. We didn't use hand drums here. This is called a clapper stick. It's split elderberry. And this is Tunet Kai Umu. Tunet Kai Umu. Ache Ie Umu. Wish. 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 Tunet Kai Umu. At the edge of the ocean. I'd like to thank our guests who are coming to share their knowledge with us today, to speak of our stone ancestors. It touches me deep in my heart to have a geologist here. I feel a very tight association with the stone relatives. Just a little insight. My father's pet name for me when I was a young child was Granite. And he and I both had a great love for stones, so I took it as a compliment. And I'd like to especially thank Rosanna. I did read her book, and I really appreciated her shedding light on the indigenous perspective of how to be in relationship with the natural world, and for teaching us about the theory of kumyam, the theory of trying to change our mindset to think of ourselves as guests here. Not that we own it. We don't own the land. We're caretakers here. And the theory of kumyam is how can we be the best possible guests here. So I really appreciated her presenting that perspective. So thank you so much. Shishpana Nekam.
Hi, my name is Patricia Kramer, and I'm here representing the Pacifica Historical Society. And all right. It's a little awkward, but the slides are going to be to the side. So don't pull any muscles or anything, but if you, you can turn your chairs a little, and it's only 10 minutes. The Pacifica Historical Society is very pleased to be one of the hosts to this event, and I'm going to be your guide during the next few minutes as we take a quick look at the history of Pacifica's shoreline over the last 100+ years. A Town on the Edge is an apt title for the chapter about Pacifica in Rosanna Xia's book. Let's begin in the South. You may be surprised to learn that Shelter Cove dates back to the late 1920s. It's always been a modest vacation place with cottages along the edge of the shoreline in front of a steep cliff. Undoubtedly, the original residents and vacationers were well aware of their vulnerability to high surf, but most of the time the seas were calm and the fishing good. Occasional storms, such as this one from 1958, would damage and even destroy housing. But residents just rebuilt, stayed put. Their houses were modest and the amenities worth the risk. In the 1980s, road access to Shelter Cove was washed out, so residents must now use steep stairs from Pedro Point District. The private enclave still survives, however, with much of the same appearance and lifestyle. Known by a series of names, San Pedro Beach, Lindamar Beach, Pacifica State Beach, is the largest and most gently sloping part of our city's shoreline. This photo from the early 1900s shows a beach configuration that actually looks a lot like what we have today. This appearance is in stark contrast to the cliffs in the north part of town that we'll see later. Perhaps Dr. Griggs has something to say about why this is. This beach also has a long history of storm damage, as this photo from the early 1900s shows. But again, these modest sheds used for farming would have been pretty straightforward to replace. Only a few houses and businesses were ever built on the ocean side of Highway 1. Those nearer the water were and are well aware of their tenuous existence. One of the houses removed in 2003 originally belonged to Pacifica's first mayor, Jean Fassler. Intermittently, her family would have to evacuate when there was threatening surf. Another structure that was there at this time was out of view to the north. It was called the Wander Inn Bar. Some of you are already anticipating what I'm going to say. Its informal motto was wander in, stagger out. Moving north to Rockaway Beach, this photo from the 1930s shows the outline of the beach with the dunes just inland. This aerial shot of Rockaway from 1950 shows increased commercial development, including a parking lot in front of Nick's restaurant. Rockaway Beach is also no stranger to periodic storm damage, as shown in this photo from 1958. The original Breakers Cafe was a bar restaurant situated where Moonraker is now. In response to such storms, riprap now armors the shoreline west of the business district, and it's obvious there's no longer a beach there. The beach on the southern side of the cove has eroded inland, but it's still a beach. Moving up to the Sharp Park area, in 1905, the southern section of Sharp Park was known as Salada Beach. You can see here where the Ocean Shore Railroad is being built. The prominent saltwater lagoon, known as Laguna Salada, was open to the sea at its north end and probably provided some natural flood control seasonally. This 1928 photo of Salada Beach area shows sand dunes near the shoreline north of Paloma Avenue. Note the many automobiles near the beach. And they are likely parked on a raised ledge just above the beach area. This is the beach in the southern part of Sharp Park before the golf course was built and opened in 1932. The darkened areas likely vegetation from that time. In 1941, 4 holes were relocated to the eastern side of the highway, although the original holes nearest to the ocean were not actually flooded from the sea, an unreinforced earthen levee was built at that time between the golf course and the ocean, and a precursor of the levee that we have there now. Sharp Park was still fairly sparsely developed in 1951. Notice in this photo the transition from a sandy beach with a natural berm on the south side to a clear lip north of the airplane wing. This shoreline feature grows higher further north, developing into the high cliffs in Pacific Manor. This aerial photo from 1955 shows Beach Boulevard as a very narrow road right next to the drop to the beach. Some of the houses from this photo are still there, making it possible to have comparison from the shoreline from 70 years ago with today's engineering seawall and promenade that extends to the west. Flooding's nothing new in Sharp Park either. This 1956 photo of the corner of Clarendon and Palmetto, a similar condition to what we saw earlier this winter. In the early 1970s, the pier was built to accompany the new sewer treatment plant, and the shoreline was lined with riprap for a relatively short distance, both north and south of the pier. Erosion continued of Beach Boulevard, as evidenced in this 1975 photo north of the pier. Now we see the world in color. After severe storm damage in the early 1980s, additional riprap was placed along the shoreline and seawalls with promenades constructed both north and south of the pier. There is essentially no beach now north of the pier. These next two photos show erosion along the shore for the most northern part of Sharp Park. Riprap has been placed by property owners along Shoreview Avenue and the Pacific Skies mobile homes. Cliff erosion is dramatic in this part of North Sharp Park, but it is just north in Pacific Manor that the loss of houses made national news along Esplanade. When the houses in Pacific Manor were built in 1948, houses on the bluff west of Esplanade were thought to have ample backyards. But 50 years later, the yards were gone, and eventually the houses were demolished. A little further north, it was a similar story for the apartment houses. Note the hopeful but ineffective riprap at the toe of the bluffs. So this is the end of our brief tour through both space and time. I hope this presentation has helped you see how our coastline has changed over the last 100+ years. Being a town on the edge is certainly not new for our area, but the consequences are certainly greater with more development. Periodic strong surf and eroding cliffs in Pacifica are a hallmark for us and expected to become even greater challenge in the future. Knowing more about our history will hopefully help us plan better. Thank you. Now I want to turn things over to Cindy Abbott, who will present the main event.
Thank you, Pat. Wow, I've seen some of those photographs in our wonderful Pacifica Coastside Museum, but it's always good to get a refresher and also just the overview altogether. So thank you so much. A couple of logistical things. Yes, I am Cindy Abbott. I'm president of Pacifica's Environmental Family. And again, thank you so much for being here tonight, this afternoon. As you came in, as folks may have mentioned to you that there's question cards over to the side and some pencils. We've got Nancy and Celeste and Margaret who will be walking around if you want to write out a question as the program proceeds, and then they'll also pick it up. We'll be doing curated questions so that we can do as many as possible after the talk, and we'll group them all together. So it might not be your exact question, but a theme is what we'll put together. Yesterday, some of you may have been at the City of Pacifica's local coastal land use plan meeting. It's been a long weekend of coastal things. So we're not here today to talk about that. That was yesterday, and there'll be a lot of opportunities to come together, talk with city staff and others. So today we're going to focus on the beautiful book and science and things about our coastal town and the coast in general here. So no questions on that today, just so that you're aware of that. And then we're also not talking about our own specific neighborhood issues. Pacificans love to talk about our neighborhood issues. But we're going to take a broader, more open approach today to talk about the coastline and our love for it and what we can do to protect her in general. We do have copies of the fabulous book in the back. So if you don't have a copy already, we've got Laura back there ready to help you out with purchasing one. They're $33. That includes tax. We appreciate our local bookstore Florries for getting those for us. There's also snacks in the back if you didn't get any of that already, so there's still lots of goodies back there. And at the end of the program, we will have our wonderful author signing the books too. So be prepared, and I did see a lot of you coming in with them, so I know you've already purchased copies and have been reading them. Okay, so it's now going to be my great pleasure here to introduce our speakers. Rosanna Xia is an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2020 for explanatory reporting, and her work has been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. She spent time here in scenic Pacifica on many occasions, and we are quite a prominent chapter in this book. And I'm going to walk over for a minute. Here's my copy. Kind of earmarked, tattered. So I found a lot in it, and I'm sure you will too if you haven't read it already. So, and while the title is California Against the Sea, my favorite part of the title is Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline. So we also today are delighted to have Dr. Gary Griggs here with us in Pacifica. He's an oceanographer, geologist, and professor who has spent decades studying the coast. He served on the state of California's Ocean Protection Council's Sea Level Rise Task Force and was part of producing the recently released draft Sea Level Rise Guidance 2024 Science and Policy Update. He's no stranger to Pacifica either. He understands the challenges here and along the California coast overall, including having written the geologic evaluation for the Beach Boulevard Seawall Replacement Project in Sharp Park. So I'm delighted now to welcome them up to the stage. Rosanna and Gary. Microphones. Tried our best to have a nice little homey atmosphere here for everybody. Adjust your pillows, get comfortable, because we're going to be here for a little bit. Okay. And on that microphone, Gary, yours is going to work best if you're holding it up like this, is what I've been told. So, okay, that's our sound guy. There you go. Yeah, okay. Ready to go?
Let's do it.
Okay, all right. We've just viewed a pictorial history of the shoreline in Pacifica. Even aside from the long-term eventuality of substantial sea level rise, haven't we seen historically, and is there fundamentally a problem with trying to draw a line in the sand, trying to create a stable shoreline in an inherently unstable environment? I know you both have topics on this. Rosanna?
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I just wanted to say first, thank you for creating the space to have this conversation. And thank you, Kata, for such a powerful and moving and beautiful opening for us. And Pat, like, I really appreciated seeing all those photos. And I think we'll be talking about kind of a lot how our baseline for normal keeps changing if we are not conscious of it. And so, you know, I continue to be so just blown away by the Pacifica Historical Society. And like, I've learned so much. I'm grateful for all the work that you all do to document and tell the story of Pacifica, past, present, and ultimately the future. And we're so lucky to have Gary Griggs here, and I feel like I should shout out that he also has a book coming out, his 14th book coming out in August, September. Is there a publication date yet?
In September now.
It's called California Catastrophes. I won't give away what it's about, but I think you have. And yeah, I mean, Gary's just knowledge of the coast is unparalleled, and I have him to thank for so much of my own understanding of the coast. And I think just lastly, before I dive into your question, I want to thank all of you. I mean, there's a whole chapter in this book about Pacifica, and I couldn't have told that story of Pacifica without just so many of you opening your doors, being willing to talk, you know, allowing me to listen, to hear, and see the coast through your eyes. And this is not an easy issue, as you all know. I think the level of engagement in this community is particularly remarkable. And that also means it can be intense and it can be tough. But ultimately, so many communities that I've been to aren't having these conversations. So the fact that this conversation is happening, that there is engagement, I think really speaks a lot. And Pacifica is ahead in that way. So to answer your question, I mean, I think one of the first things that really blew my mind is just recognizing that the basic fact that the coast itself is not static. And so many people today still think of the coast as this static place that doesn't move, that every time you go back to the beach, it's supposed to still be there and it's supposed to look exactly the same as it was before. I was guilty of this when I first moved out to California. But you know, if you are on any beach and you stand there for an afternoon and you look at the tide line, every time the waves come ashore, that line is different. It's never the same twice. Yeah, and then you look back and you look at Beach Boulevard in LA where I'm living, I look at Pacific Coast Highway, you think of the rail line that goes all the way to San Diego. The way we've engineered our landscapes and built, our coast as we know it today kind of is trying to impose this permanence onto an inherently impermanent space. And what does it mean to start thinking about the coast as not a place, but more of a dynamic process and a place that is constantly changing? I think that is at the core some of the really intense questions and conflicts that we're having now, because it is challenging this notion of what it means to live along an ever-changing line in the sand rather than a fixed line in the sand that we've been trying to hold on to. And I know Gary, the geologist, could probably speak more to that actual line. But I mean, I was just mind blown from a narrative perspective, oh my God, the coast isn't even a place, it's a process. And how that's about just, I'm still processing that.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Rosanna. It's an honor to be here today, and I thank you for inviting me. And Rosanna, it's always good to speak with you. I've been studying the coast for a long time. In fact, I'm reminded when I started at UC Santa Cruz, for some of you, these names will sound familiar. Lyndon Johnson was president. My students say, who was Lyndon Johnson? Ronald Reagan was governor, and our governor was just celebrating his first birthday. And I've outlived them all. So it's always a little awkward to come to a community where people have been here for 30, 40, 50 years and have invested their lives and their income. And so my goal as a scientist is one of education and not advocacy. I try not to come across on one side of an issue or another. And I know it's a community where there's a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives. And I think the way you put it, Rosanna, that beach is not a place, but it's a process that's constantly changing. And we can go back, as a geologist, we think about geologic time. So if we go back, I'm sure you all remember this, 18,000 years ago. We were at the end of the last ice age, and about 3% of the world's oceans, about 10 million cubic miles of seawater, left the ocean and was now on the land as ice sheets and glaciers. So sea level dropped about 400 feet. So at the Golden Gate, you could have walked, if you walk quickly, 30 miles offshore to the Farallones. So as the climate warmed, sea level rose for two reasons. As the ocean warms, it expands. And as ice melts, it flows into the ocean. And all ice melts at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. That shoreline moved inland. And if we look globally, from about 6,000 years ago to the present, sea level was essentially constant. We were at the end of a warm period, and without human activity, shoreline, the climate would have started to get cool again, shoreline would have started moving back offshore. That didn't happen. So we need that perspective to see, what can happen over time. That historical presentation was great. And I think we need to look back and see what we've learned over the years. And I think photographs are things that are hard to sort of deny. This is what it was like. So I think we need to keep that long-term picture in mind. And I think your question was about, can we draw a line in the sand? Depends on what that line consists of and where you drew it. Is that line a wall? Is it a road? Is it a beach? Is it way back on the profile? Is it right on the edge? And we have an entire range of those on the California coast. So for example, on Ocean Beach in San Francisco, the O'Shaughnessy Wall, it's been there since 1928, but it's a massive wall. It costs probably, $15,000 a foot to build that today. We have other walls that haven't lasted 6 weeks. So a lot of variables that go into what that line is.
Okay, so even when we try to be permanent, doesn't always work out so much. You write a bit, Rosanna, about the different ways that we've been trying to address sea level rise. And Gary, you've been a part of a lot of studies to help communities understand what is and isn't possible. But it seems that here on the very wild and rugged San Mateo County coast, that is not like Southern California, where I grew up too, with those long, much wider sandy beaches. So it's wild out there. We're seeing that this winter again. Are coastal communities putting all of their eggs in one basket and continuing on engineering solutions such as seawalls, coastal bluff stabilization, and other mechanisms to control the risks from the ocean? And what about things like beach nourishment that aren't uncommon south of here from Santa Cruz down to San Diego? From a coastal science perspective, how viable is sand replenishment? As you can tell, I've got multi-part questions. And what are the social and environmental costs of these solutions? Are there stories you can share from other communities that we can learn from? Rosanna? Who wants to start?
There are a lot of questions there. Do you want to take a crack at
Sure.
some of them? And
Yeah, give you a break. So where the shoreline is retreating, which is most places around the planet, and one thing that's really important to keep in mind, most of our conversation is around sea level rise. Does anybody know how fast sea level is rising today? I think we tend to think of this as, it's astronomical. Somebody had an answer.
I think it's about half an inch.
Not too bad. Good. Okay, so 2100 is out there, but if we look at the way we measure sea level rise today in two ways. One is tide gauges, a water level recorder that's on a pier or a breakwater, and we have the closest one to us is in San Francisco. It's been there for 150, well, since 1855. The rate there is about 1/10 of an inch a year, about 2/4. If we look at the global picture, because local levels are relative, if we have a tide gauge at the Golden Gate and the land is rising or the land is sinking, that number is going to be different. So if you look at Alaska, hold on here, sea level's dropping relative to the land because the land is rebounding from having been covered with ice, thousands of feet of ice. So they're not worried about sea level rise in Alaska. Venice is sinking. New Orleans is sinking, so there the sea level rise rate for that land is much faster. San Francisco is about half of the global number. So globally, we're now measuring it from satellites. We have to know where these satellites are down to 100th of a millimeter relative to land and relative to space. So the global number for the last 10 years is a little less than 1/4 of an inch a year. So what I think is really important to realize is what's happening along Pacifica's coast, what happened on the Esplanade in 1983 and 97, 98, is not sea level rise. It's these short-term extreme events. Really high tides coming at times of very large waves, and an El Nino event elevates the sea level. So in 1983, sea level in San Francisco was 2 feet above predicted. This last winter, it was a little over 1 foot above predicted. So that's compared to 1/10 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch a year. It's the events we've seen in recent years that are going to be damaging, most damaging. By 2050, 2100, it's going to be a different story, but we're a long way from there. And most of us, I'm going to hazard a guess, aren't going to live till 2100. I really want to be here, but I don't think I'm going to make it. So you mentioned nourishment. Well, okay. Am I taking too much time? Okay. So if we look at Pacifica or Newport or, Capitola or San Francisco, with sea level rising, the shoreline moving inland, we basically have 4 choices. One is denial. That's what Florida uses. And actually Louisiana also. There's armor, and we know what that's about, and that's what's dominated our sort of protection in California for a century. And if we look at the entire coast of California today, about 14% has been armored. But if you look at Southern California, 38% has been armored. So we've got denial, armoring, and we have nourishment, which is one of your questions. We don't really do, well, there's 2 kinds of nourishment. What we could call, sort of opportunistic nourishment. If we dredge the sand out of the Santa Cruz Harbor and put it on the beach down coast, we're really bypassing it. We're not putting on new sand. And most of California does that. San Diego has done 2 big nourishment projects where they actually went offshore to get sand and put it on the beach. The East Coast does that year after year after year after year. They've spent $15 billion on sand. Palm Beach has been nourished 71 times. A wise person might say, wow, this isn't working. So that's a little bit different, and it's relatively short-lived, maybe a year or 2, and very expensive. That's the 3rd option. The 4th option, I'm not going to tell you. I would like Rosanna to say why those 2 words aren't very popular.
So, to build on some of what Gary just said and also to address the rest of your questions, I think, one of the things I learned pretty quickly is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for not even like any city, but neighborhoods within cities and parcels within neighborhoods. And, there's also no magic solution. I feel like in a lot of these earlier conversations I had years ago with folks, there was this still kind of like sentiment that if we just kept waiting, the magic solution would happen, or that the technology would be advanced enough that we'd figure it out. And so let's just kind of continue living our lives without really having to think about it. And I think, some of the themes that really emerge for me, and just like the through lines, is that we still have time, but we are running out of time, and a lot of what we need to start doing is really talking about it and thinking through this process of what this future that we're moving towards. And I think ultimately, like all of these options, and I'll say it, managed retreat is the fourth option, and it is possibly the most worst branded terminology that has come into existence. And we can talk more about that. But I think, ultimately all of these choices, sand, is part of your question, is about buying time and how much, and I think the question isn't like, are we putting all our eggs in one basket, or is this the right solution for the community? The question is, how much are we willing to pay for it, and for how long? And, with the sand question, I also immediately started wondering, where is all the sand going to come from if every beach community suddenly wants sand renourishment to be their solution? Who even owns the sand? And you kind of, on the East Coast, you're starting to see kind of sand wars going on. And also, like, you can't just take sand from anywhere and place it on the beach. The beach also is very picky about what kind of sand it wants. So I think, and then with seawalls, like, I think, not all seawalls are created equal. That's also another thing that really emerged in the course of my reporting. And again, with the seawall, it's like, how much are we willing to pay, and who pays to maintain a seawall, to fix it every time it breaks? And similarly with sand, it's a race against nature. And I think those are not science questions. Those are social questions. Those are economic questions. And those are ultimately questions that should be posed to a community, and a community should decide what it is that they actually want to value, and how much are they willing to pay to build towards what it is that they want for the future of their community. So, that's kind of a roundabout way of answering the question, because, we talk about what are the solutions, but I think what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? And I think ultimately something that I've felt a lot in my conversations with various communities is, so often we talk about sea level rise as like something that we need to defend against, and we talk a lot about what it is that we're going to lose, and we talk about what we're afraid of losing. But ultimately, responding to sea level rise could also be an opportunity and a planning process to build and plan and vision towards something different, and to really reset as a community, and to think through what it is that we actually want 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now in the community. So, and in that way, what is the solution becomes a different kind of question, right? So I think some of it's framing, some of it comes back to the options that Gary just laid out. But ultimately, I think that we have pigeonholed ourselves into certain ways of talking about this issue, and it doesn't have to be this way if someone just, hits the reset button. So I hope that kind of helps address some of the questions. I want to make sure that we answered all of them.
Great job, but I think we've got to.
Just a quick response. Anything that we build, anything that we employ is going to be temporary. As long as the climate continues to warm and our carbon dioxide keeps going up, sea level is going to continue to rise. So now another question. If we melted all of the rest of the ice on the planet, how high could sea level rise? 12 feet. 160 feet. 200. So if we melt all of the land ice, the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, we could raise sea level about 2 feet. If we melt all of Greenland, 24 feet. If we melt all of Antarctica, 190 feet. Are we above that level here? So about 216 feet of total sea level rise. That has happened in the geologic past, period we called hothouse Earth. And we've had a snowball Earth when it was frozen, but that's possible. No one thinks that's going to happen this year or next year or this century or next century, but we don't need 216 feet of sea level rise to create havoc around the planet. So the rate we're going with burning fossil fuels and so forth, and the fact that there's so much greenhouse gas built into the atmosphere that no matter what we do tomorrow, we can't change that very quickly. We can start to slow it down. So whatever we do is going to be temporary, but is that 50 years or 20 years or 40 years? One other statement. Well, I have the microphone. I had a colleague, and I think, Bob, you may have taken classes from Bob Weigel when you were at Berkeley. Really distinguished coastal engineer. And I'd always come up, became good friends. He was, I don't know, 25, 30 years older. Whenever I'd come up with this new idea, he'd say, Gary, for every complex problem, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. So I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, I think I was reminded, I think the other thing that really came into clarity for me in the process of just talking to so many people up and down, a massive and very diverse coastline, was just realizing that so many folks still think of responding to sea level rise as this like massive one-time action that costs a lot, is scary, and is calling for a lot of sacrifice, whether it is just like, a big vote about whether or not to include managed retreat in a document, or whether or not we should do X or X. And I think, again, the shift in framing is, responding to sea level rise is actually a process. It's an ongoing process, and I think recognizing that what we want and what we need in the short term is going to be somewhat different at some point in the long term. And it's that sticky middle period, that transition period, that's really scary. And that uncertainty is truly terrifying, and I think really hard to explain to, a community, to navigate within the systems that we've constructed for ourselves. And I think that, to me, is also buying time, and how do you help guide a community through that transition process. And I was talking to another kind of disaster expert on the East Coast, and she posed it as, how do you convince people to eat broccoli today so that they won't have a heart attack 70 years from now? And I think that was like a really interesting way to put it, because I think we all know on some gut level that the world is not going to look the same 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now. But we also know that none of the changes that we need to make to respond to that needs to happen today. And so, again, it's like that middle ground and that process, and how do we do that? And I think that's where, rather than talk about the solution 70 years from now, how about talking about the direction that we want to go towards, and how do we start taking those steps? And then you did have a question about what are other communities are doing. The one thought that came to mind was Cardiff, down in like San Diego County. The coastal highway there has been flooding pretty frequently during high wave events and just compounding kind of extreme events. And a couple years ago, it was like a massive team effort of state and local government. But I think there was acknowledgement that the highway needs to move at some point, because the beach used to be there, and the beach is now here, and the water is like over here. And there was a very reasonable discussion kind of recognizing that that the Caltrans wasn't ready to move that highway. It was going to take forever, and there's like a lot of process built into that, and design, and figuring out where to move the highway and all of that. So, the traditional approach might be to build a seawall or a revetment to kind of just hold the line. But, what does it mean to actually buy time? And so the State Coastal Conservancy kind of helped shepherd this middle ground project where they built a rock revetment along the highway, but built a dune system, put sand on top of it. There's now a coastal trail on top of the dune. That sometimes the sand is completely washed out. Other times the sand is rebuilding. But ultimately, the Coastal Conservancy said, this is not the end solution. This is just buying you 10, 15, 20 more years so that you can figure out in that 20-year time frame how to move the highway. And so, that is not a solution, again, that's going to work in other communities, depending on the geography and the topography and just how much space there is. But I think ultimately that kind of project where you're acknowledging what needs to happen many years from now, and then acknowledging that we need time to figure that out and to start that process, I think that was a really powerful way to look at this issue somewhat differently than how other communities are currently talking about it.
So we're going to continue on this a little bit more, and the idea of process and time. I'm sure Rosanna and Gary, you probably both hear a lot, I hear it a lot, that we don't really need to be talking about it right now. Gary, you said a lot of this is way off in the future, but at the same time, we know that planning, like you just mentioned, takes a long time to come up with the right solution, to find the funding for it, and to move forward. So too often we hear, oh, it's going to be 2050, 2100. We don't know, there might be new engineering techniques. So let's keep waiting. And let's keep waiting too, because it's going to impact my property values today. I live on the coast. I live half a block up from Beach Boulevard. So, we frequently hear it's going to impact my property values. I'm not going to be able to get a loan. What about insurance? So how do we help communities shift to thinking about the future? And that mode of thinking that where do we want to be 50 or 100 years from now, and how do we actually plan for that? I think that Santa Cruz has done some work on that recently on their Westcliff Drive, and they did a backcasting process of, we want to be at this point in, I think, 50 years ahead they planned for. And then they worked to what they see as the steps are to get there. So how can we, consider that while also thinking of these? We heard that we don't own this land, really and truly. We're sharing it today with the earth. But how do we balance all those things of planning for the future, which seems to be really hard for us to figure out to do?
Well, as I said in the beginning, I think the problems for at least the next 50 years are going to be these short-term extreme events. I say we're really preoccupied with sea level rise and how many tenths of a millimeter per year. But that's not what's overtopping Beach Boulevard. And I was amazed because we walked a lot of that this morning all the way up to Maury Point, that there's a perched, in Bob Battalio's words, there's a perched beach now. All that beach gravel's ending up on Beach Boulevard. Maybe, where's my slide guy? I'm just going to show. And I have my industrial strength pointer here.
We're all getting a little bit of Gary's classes down at UC Santa Cruz here today.
I was going to bring a blackboard, but I couldn't fit it in the car. Warm up? Okay. The 1928, and then we'll do the most recent one. God. That's it. So most of you won't remember this. This is the first aerial photograph taken of the California coast in 1928. It's pretty amazing because Lindbergh flew the Atlantic in 1926. We were still learning how to fly airplanes. I've got a big one here. Yeah.
That is industrial.
So this was for what was going to be not the Ocean Shore Railway, but the Ocean Shore Highway. So here is the Beach Boulevard section. You can still see Laguna Salada, but what you can see is a wide beach, and these are dunes. This is where the sand, the excess sand, was blowing up over what became Beach Boulevard. So that was almost a century ago. Big change from what it is today. I mean, you can see this big pile of sand. That's further north, but you can also see, if you look carefully, the dunes are blowing inland. So there's more sand. There wasn't anything built there. If we go to the next, I think I just put in 3 slides. Oh, actually, we showed that. You showed that one already. So go to, so there's 1972. Again, you can see there's still a beach here. There's a low bluff, not much development along Beach Boulevard. Now, why don't we just jump forward to the 2023. That's 1979. That's okay. That one, 23, the next one. There we go. It's nice to have a technician here. So this is from Google Earth, and you can see Maury Point, and that acts as a natural groin. So the sand that's moving south builds up against that. The beach is wider here. But you can see where the back of that beach would have been naturally, would have been inland. Inland of where Beach Boulevard is now. So what has been done over the years is we've encroached out onto the shoreline. That just makes it difficult to ever rebuild that beach. There is the possibility that you mentioned of beach nourishment. We almost would have to create a new headland here to trap that sand. But if this development weren't here, that first row and all the empty space, you could see that beach would continue. So we've sort of modified the natural environment in a way that's very difficult now to step back from. I don't even remember what the question was now.
Well, so thank you for showing those, and it's true. Living in that area, my front yard is all sand. I have no other soil. It's just beach sand, and as are my neighbors and everything. So,
well, it was amazing as we walked this today that this gravel is washed over the wall, covering the road, covering the old landscaping into people's front yard, which is this constant reminder that you're living on the old beach.
right.
Which is a difficult thing to now turn around.
Right. I've always said I live on a sand dune, and it's true. So we've heard that, you've just mentioned, so some of the engineering solutions that we've talked about and have shared are really difficult to do here, and they cost a lot of money, as you brought up, Rosanna, in planning. So how do we shift to a new vision for the future? How do we think about what we want to leave and provide future generations? How do we do that future visioning projects? And have you had conversations with people in other communities, Rosanna, to be able to help shift our focus?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer that question and combine it with your previous question, which was on time and how we perceive time and how we help people answer some of these questions. And I think that if you think about so much of all the systems that we are kind of forced to operate under, we're forced to think and make decisions based on timeframes that ultimately feel pretty arbitrary in the grand scheme of things if you think about the geologic time. But the 30-year mortgage is one that comes up a lot. People think also in 2-year and 4-year political terms. I think the general plans and the master plans of communities are sometimes the 20-year master plan or the 25-year master plan. And, all these time frames really, our insurance renews every year. So all of these time frames are forcing us to make decisions that don't necessarily sync up with how we have to be thinking about this issue increasingly. And I think another point to your earlier question about insurance and what it all means for our homes, I kind of just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, there are so many people who tend to get vilified in this conversation. And in the course of my reporting, I was listening to Naomi Klein on a radio interview a couple months ago, and she recently came out with a book on conspiracy theories, and she said that conspiracy theorists get the facts wrong, but the emotions right. And that has really stuck with me, because I think the way we enter these conversations, I think for me, it's really hearing what someone is worried about. And I think often I talk to folks and I ask them, what questions do you have? What are you worried about? What are you afraid of? And I think coming from that space and just kind of hearing, I want to know what it means whether or not I can refinance my home. What does it mean if this policy does this? And what does that mean for these things that I, am still hanging on to? And I think hearing those questions, collecting those questions, and then posing it to the people in power who can possibly help guide those questions, I think connecting those dots are so important, but it begins with validating someone's emotions and to say it is okay to be afraid and angry. And discombobulated by this conversation. And it is okay to be like completely unmoored on what to do, because again, we are forced to make decisions and to think through our personal cost benefit analyses based on these flawed systems, or not flawed systems, but timeframes that are no longer in sync with some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And so to your second question on visioning, I think, let's just talk about managed retreat. Managed retreat feels more like a slogan than more than anything, because I think what is actually a managed retreat? It is part of a set of processes to help the community think about what it is that they want to move towards. And managed retreat in itself is not the goal. I've heard that from a number of folks. It's a poorly branded term, but it honestly, is part of this broader conversation about what it is that we want for our future. How do we get there? What does a community still want 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now? And how do we get there? And then finally, the last question I feel like is so core to so much of this is, how do we make it feel fair? How do we make sure that that process of getting from the short term to the identified long-term values and wants and needs, like how do we make sure people don't feel left behind in this process? How do we make sure people don't feel like some people got to win and others got to lose? And ultimately, we're all going to have to give up something, but that give up something doesn't have to be framed in a way of feeling like we're losing out. And so a lot of it, again, and I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller, I'm a thinker, so I feel like I'm thinking about how to reframe these conversations. And I think to land back in a more concrete example, I kept asking, how do we start doing this transition? And so Senator Ben Allen, based in Santa Monica, came up with this idea a couple of years ago that I know he had kind of worked with a lot of researchers at UCLA, consultants who've worked with communities kind of really in the trenches of navigating these questions. And he was like, well, the whole point is helping people navigate time, right? Time, transition, recognizing again that we still have homes today and concerns about maintaining market value, but ultimately 30, 40, 50 years from now, it's going to be very, very different. And so he came up with this idea where a community might be able, a city might be able to buy, or state land trust could buy a set of properties that at market value that will probably have to be relocated at some point because the ocean's moving in. Buy it at market value, rent it out for 20 or 30 years and recoup the costs by doing so. And that kind of starts to answer the question of fairness, right? And that bill was introduced twice in the state legislature. It passed both the state Senate and the state assembly pretty unanimously. Governor Newsom vetoed it both times, and I think his official veto message kind of cited cost concerns and kind of where is that money coming from? Where would that money come from? And I think, again, it's this interesting circular conversation. And we do need to make changes. No one's quite ready to take that first step. But again, that first step doesn't have to be the big action. It's just the beginning of a process towards something different that the community has decided this is what they want for the community.
And I think that it was interesting. Some here were maybe at our talk with Dr. Charles Lester in January, and he brought up a project that started back in the 1930s. So while this sounds like a new idea, back then they visioned of how they wanted to reconnect with Monterey Bay, and how they started little by little over decades. It's still going on now. They've been buying up property as people are leaving, and so it's not costing a big outlay at one period of time. It's been a gradual time up to now and continuing to reclaim back parcels and then to make them public space and to give the sea space to breathe into that. So that concept and everything I thought was fascinating. And as you've both shared, the idea of process and how this takes a long time, and we have the time, it sounds like, to do this sound planning and visioning for the future. Gary, were you gonna?
No, I was just gonna say, the fact that we have the time is both good and bad.
Right. Right, because it does. It leads to that other side of, then we don't need to move forward right now. And so that kind of leads into a question that we have next, which is about funding. And so between planning for projects and receiving then funding for it, that's a very intense and long process. And I think something that we get stuck on too, of where's the money going to come from. So you talk about in Imperial Beach down in the San Diego area as well, about how climate change funding, particularly for cities like Imperial Beach, and City of Pacifica, we have small budgets, but we have a lot of coastline. So what do you think we're going to be able to expect with all of these, not only local areas, we have San Francisco Bay, we have all of California, we have the entire country. So as we're thinking about envisioning for the future, is there going to be enough money for all of this? How should we be kind of setting our expectations?
I would just say, in the long run, and it depends on what we call the long run. Nobody wants to hear this, but I'm going to say it. There's absolutely nothing we can do to hold back the Pacific Ocean over the long run. We can hold it back till 2030, maybe 2040, maybe 2050, but no matter what we build, we can only build walls so high. We can only put so much sand on the beach. And the rate our climate is changing, we cannot stop sea level from rising anytime soon. And that's really discouraging, but I think we need to be realistic that everything is a sort of a transitional step. And I think that's why Rosanna's book is so important. It's like visioning for the future. And one of the things about walls, and I've spent 30 years studying seawalls, there's a lot of impacts they have. And one of those that's probably the most important is what we call passive erosion. So if the shoreline here had never been touched, sea level keeps rising, we'll move the beach and the shoreline inland. And that's why we have a beach today, and we had one 18,000 years ago when the coast was 20 miles offshore. But as soon as we fix the back beach with a highway, a wall, a revetment, basically we drown the beach, we flood the beach. And that's what's happening, from the pier north. So that's going to be one of the effects of building a permanent structure. So a choice to build the wall and protect what's behind it is a choice to lose the beach. And that's not conjecture, that's just the way sea level rises. And the U.S. Geological Survey has done some work in Southern California where, again, 38% of the beaches have been armored. And those beaches get tens of millions of visitors. That's what you're eventually going to lose. And the question for community, is that worth it?
I think the funding questions are what keep me up at night. I think there are some really big questions that are still unanswered, and I think every community I go to, there is the sentiment that if we do this, we might get state funding, or we might be able to apply for this grant, or the feds will be able to help us with this, or I guess we'll work with the Army Corps because they'll be able to give us a couple $1 million for whatever support. But if everyone starts to do that, and everyone is, and then you look FEMA is bankrupt, and you look at, there's the argument for preparing ahead of a disaster because after the disaster it costs even more, but kind of the cycles we continue to go through is that we throw money at a problem after a town completely gets leveled by a wildfire, or we declare a state of emergency after a whole chunk of a community falls into the ocean. And we then don't have enough money to distribute for the preparedness aspect of it. So I think there's this kind of cycle that's not quite working, but no one's quite really ready to figure out how to break out of that cycle. I also think, one of the other kind of unspoken tensions that I run into in a lot of smaller communities like Pacifica and Imperial Beach is this question of a lot of the revenue comes from property taxes, and what happens when your most valuable properties, which are along the coast, are getting phased out, or how does that domino effect happen? And there's a lot of what ifs and a lot of unanswered questions, but I think, again, we need to validate that concern, address it, don't talk around it. And I think it is, and ultimately kind of this looking to the state or the feds for support is a really tough question that I think, and I just mentioned that buy and rent back bill that failed twice because, again, even the notion of like, will the governor, does he think it's a wise enough idea? Like, where's the money gonna come from for that upfront cost that will ultimately get recouped 30 years from now? Like, funding is something that is the sticky question everywhere. But then I also think about kind of how we spend money in this country and in our society. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, so Measure AA in the Bay Area, the broader Bay Area, got passed a couple years ago now, but just, dozens of scientists and conservationists and environmental kind of planners kind of came together years ago. They were like, we need to restore 100,000 acres of wetlands in the broader Bay Area that will help build resilience. And how do we do that? We need $1.5 billion, and this was a number that was guesstimated like 10, 20 years ago, so I'm assuming that number has increased by now. But the idea was, let's figure out how to raise $500 million in local money so that the state can match $500 million, and then the federal government can match $500 million. That will get us to $1.5 billion. And it took like 8 years to figure out how to get the measure passed and to craft it the right way. And the voters agreed a couple years ago that, yes, we will tax ourselves $12 per parcel across the entire Bay Area, whether we live inland or along the shoreline, to contribute towards this $500 million, which at this point will aggregate in 20 years. And then as I'm driving to one of these wetland restoration projects that are now in motion because of this tax, I drive by the football stadium that got built for $1.3 billion in bond money and a bunch of other public-private structures. And I'm like, okay, so we're willing to pay pretty easily $1.3 billion for a football stadium. And it took how many years to convince people to chip in $12 a year per parcel to restore wetlands? And I think that also, so it's like the money is there. How do we want to spend it? What is it that we value? Those are all questions that science can't necessarily answer. Those are all questions that I think a community, again, going back to the visioning and the valuing process, like what is it that we actually want? How do we want to pay for it? And how much are we willing to pay for it? Those are all questions that there is no right answer. It's just a conversation that needs to happen, and it needs to be conscious.
So what do we love?
I love football, by the way, so just for the... Go 49ers. I'm from LA.
Yeah, thank you. That's really something to think about, because if we just even think of our daily spending and things, and what would we want to allocate it to for something that we love and could support, our environment and our planet and future generations. So really something to think about. Thank you.
2 lattes are saving all the wetlands.
Yeah, no, and that's basically what the measure was, and I think they used that a little bit in it. So we did touch a bit on already on the increasing intensity, and that sea level rise is potentially, particularly here in our area, somewhat in the future. But you were down again in Imperial Beach. Your chapter was grappling with retreat, which everybody along the coast is doing. And here in Pacifica, the conversation on frequency, I know, has come up quite often with studies by Patrick Bernard at the USGS. And I remember a meeting at the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, and that's the slide that stuck with me and that I've used a lot, that it's really not sea level rise right at this moment. But we're seeing every single winter, and even now in the summer, the ongoing change and dramatic impacts of storms. So the question is, with these stronger and more frequent storms that we're having, what's the societal toll of having to deal with these pretty much constant emergencies? It seems like, we've already had 3 in Pacifica here just in this last winter alone, not even counting the past years. And what's the impact both on the natural geology of the area and to the infrastructure such as seawalls that are just being inundated and hit more and more and more? And these things are being designed for a limited amount of sea level rise. but we're just being barraged by the strength and power of the ocean. So Gary, maybe the scientific question for you on what's the impact of this on our built structure and geology, and Rosanna, then you for the stories you can share how that's impacting us.
Well, one term I've come to is what I call people have a short disaster memory. And that, we're kind of, as people, we're resilient. I'm having problems with resilient communities, but that's another story. We forget about, let's go on, we'll rebuild, the fire came through, we're going to rebuild our house. But if you stop and look at, say, Pacifica, I was up here in the El Nino of 1983, and all those homes along the Embarcadero were, they rebuilt a new rock revetment. By 97, 98, they were all gone. The trailers got moved back. And then it came up to the apartments, and now they're gone. So, the evidence is surrounding us that these events, and if we look at sort of the projections for climate change, we're getting warmer ocean water, more evaporation, stronger winds, more rainfall. There's some indication that waves are getting larger, which would be consistent with climate change. Whether El Niños occur more frequently is still not completely clear, but I think the direction we're going, along with this slow sea level rise, is all in the wrong direction for us, who's built along the shoreline. And if we look around the planet, because you mentioned that earlier, it's not just Pacific and Santa Cruz, but most of the world's mega cities, those over 10 million people, New York, Miami, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Lagos, Dhaka, are at sea level. They were built on the coast for a bunch of logical reasons, but sea level was constant throughout the history of human occupation until maybe the last 50, 60 years. So we didn't plan for this. I looked recently at most of the major airports in the US that are on the coast. They're all out over the water because there wasn't any land left to build one in San Francisco. San Francisco starts to go underwater with about 1.5 feet above high tide. And you may know they're planning a $587 million 10-mile long seawall that they think will work till 2080. The airport in New Orleans, Louis Armstrong, is already below sea level. Miami's at sea level, Boston Logan, Washington National. So there's a whole nother part of our infrastructure that's huge economic engines. But I think trying to deal with that, I will say, is probably the biggest problem human civilization has ever had to face. COVID's going to go away. I'm not going to get into politics, but some people are going to go away. And we're going to have this staring us in the face for decades to come. So I think this idea of what do communities want to look like in 10 or 20 or 30 years, we kind of need to start looking out and trying to figure out, from my view, are there trigger points where we say, okay, and this is, I think, what happened up on the Esplanade, when the 90-foot high cliff is 5 feet out your back door of the apartment, it's not safe anymore. We got to do something. Maybe when you're living on Beach Boulevard and your house is flooded every 2 weeks, it's probably getting time to do something. So can we agree on trigger points where we have to do something, whatever that something is, rather than sort of denial?
Okay, I have 3 thoughts, so you're going to help me remember them because. Okay, I'm going to talk about shifting baselines, frequency, and compounding disasters. Remind me if I don't do all 3. So first one, shifting baselines. I do think I mentioned this earlier. Our baseline for normal keeps shifting, and we stop. And it's actually like a theory that a lot of people study. But I think the number of people I've talked to who tell me, oh, the beach used to be out there, or there used to be a set of homes before the set of homes, but then we kind of keep forgetting. I think also. We've been really good at documenting it in some ways, like Pat's presentation at the beginning. But also, you mentioned Imperial Beach in your question. Their beach boulevard is Seacoast Drive. And when a team of scientists from Scripps started working with the community to start thinking about how to, wrap their minds around this issue, I think someone asked a question like, how many times do you keep track like of how many times the waves crash over the main seawall? And they had no data points on that. Like no one kept track. They just cleaned up the rocks and bulldozed the sand before everyone woke up to go to work in the morning. And so someone joked that, Imperial Beach was really good at cleaning up the dead bodies before people woke up, so that we were allowed to maintain this sense of normalcy, even though if you actually started tracking it, the number of times the waves were breaking over the seawall was increasing in frequency. So I think whatever tools we can do, it doesn't have to come from the city, it doesn't have to come from a fancy academic institution, it could be citizen science-based. This idea of just helping each other recognize that our baseline for normal is changing and to document these changes in a way that helps us see patterns and to recognize change, that's really powerful. What was my next one? Frequency. I don't want to speak for the scientists, and I feel like Gary might be able to build on this, but I think it's been really fascinating for me as a communicator of this issue that, when I first started covering and writing about sea level rise, I think the way we talked about the issue was like end of year projections, that by 2100 we should expect the sea to rise from 3 feet to 7 feet, depending on the best case scenario versus business as usual, yada, yada, yada. And then a couple years ago, we started shifting it to the midterm because everyone was like, oh crap, end of century feels way too abstract, no one's really paying attention, and also we're able to there's always something more pressing to think about besides 2100. And so the state a couple years ago kind of shifted towards this, what do we need to plan for by 2050? And so more than like 17 state agencies kind of related to coastal planning or has to think about coastal planning in some way, kind of committed to prepare their infrastructure and as many communities as possible for 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. That number got disputed a lot. Some people thought that was too extreme, others thought it was not enough, but the state was like, let's just 3.5 by 2050, that feels more tangible and a little bit closer. 2050 is less than a 30-year mortgage away. That's something we can start thinking about. And then more recently, I feel like the conversation has shifted towards this notion of frequency and sunny day, like high tide flooding, and kind of just recognizing actually, if you look at the numbers for the 2030s, the number of high tide flooding, the number of times the waves will crash over the seawall, or the number of times your parking lot will be underwater is going to increase in frequency, and we don't actually have to wait for 3.5 feet of sea level rise to do something. And so finally, my last point with compounding disasters, I think a lot of folks, especially in kind of the modeling projection space, are recognizing that you can't just talk about sea level rise in a silo. You look at, 10 years ago, I saw so many maps where they're like, the line will move inland this much and this much under all these different scenarios. But what about when it's also the fifth back-to-back atmospheric river and, the rain, the extreme precipitation has swelled all our rivers and our wetlands are at capacity and the water is trying to flush into the ocean, but the ocean is also trying to move in because of high tide event and high swells and, this idea that and then the groundwater could be rising and, if it was after a really intense wildfire season, the ground is not soaking the water as much. There are all these compounding aspects that are increasingly happening at the same time. And how do we project for that? How do we model for that? And how do we prepare for all of it rather than having the wildfire folks and the drought folks talk about their issues and their projections in one corner and the sea level rise folks talking about another corner and the extreme precipitation people not talking to the sea level rise people? And when you start adding all these numbers together and factoring in what happens if more than one projection happens at the same time, you realize that we shouldn't be thinking about 2050, we should be thinking about now. And so I think the communication of the risks have been, improving in a way that it's feeling a lot less abstract. And I think that will ultimately hopefully help more communities start to think about the tangible preparations that we need to make, now versus later.
And that's I really appreciate that. And even here in Pacifica, we all had the day of orange sky that we never saw the sun and the wildfire smoke. So it is all happening. So Gary, you brought up this word, and it's something we're hearing a lot about, resilience. However, that word in relationship to climate crisis and the coast is used in a lot of different ways. Rosanna, in your book, you documented a conversation you had with Dr. Charles Lester, that those who continue to think about man versus nature, resilience means having the strength to rebuild in the same place after a catastrophe, to resume life as it was before, make sure we're strong enough to not be changed. But he posed the idea of, should we be thinking about changing? So what are your thoughts on resilience? And is resilience in a world of climate change about being able to embrace change?
I'd love to. So I've been thinking about resilience a lot recently, and there was a series of conferences that UC Irvine had for 4 or 5 years, and they were all essentially the same title, Building Resilient Coastal Communities. And Charles Lester and I were both asked to give talks, and after about the 5th time I said, what is a resilient coastal community? Show me one. And then I asked the person who was putting them on, because Columbia University now has had 2 conferences a couple years apart. It was called At What Point Manage Retreat. Very different than Building Resilient Coastal Communities. And so I asked the person who was putting this on, why don't you change the title of your conference? And she said, well, because Newport Beach is funding it and they don't want to use that title. So anyway, I published a paper a couple weeks ago called Can We Make California's Coastal Communities Resilient? So that and living shorelines are 2 concepts that get used a lot, and they're sort of comforting. Just resilient, just sounds nice. Sort of like sustainability. But what does it really mean? Is if we build a big enough seawall, does that mean we're resilient? Does it mean, like Charles was saying, or the definition, we get destroyed and we come back and build the same thing in the same place? To me, that isn't resilient. It's sort of foolhardy. So I'm still struggling with the wording, and we're putting a lot of money today. Cities and counties are getting money to do coastal resilience planning, but I think we need to agree on what that really means and what counts. It's like the definition of living shoreline. I think of something green. And certainly mangroves and coral reefs are effective. Does kelp or seaweed help? It turns out it really doesn't reduce wave energy. Can we plant stuff on our coastal cliffs here? No. Ice plant? No. But if you look at the definitions, it says, green stuff and sand and even rocks count as a living shoreline. I want to say, give me a frickin' break. Are rocks living shorelines? That's what we have already. So I'm questioning some of these things that we're using as sort of an easy out to things that are really much more complicated. Because if I ask you, you'd all love to have a resilient shoreline and a green shoreline.
I have so many thoughts. In the process of writing this book, I feel like there were a number of words that really challenged me, and I feel like I went on a pretty intense philosophical journey on what these words actually mean. And I mean, a quick story, so in like 2010, 2011, I remember one of my first kind of environmental stories, or at that point I was writing more about public infrastructure and earthquakes, and I tried to use the word resilience in an article, and my editor was like, I don't know what the F that means. So there's a lot of swearing in the newsroom. But it was interesting, like I actually have not been able to get the word resilient into a newspaper article because it's vague, it's wonky. It's more prevalent now, and you all probably are familiar with the word, but it's still, what does it actually mean? And it's not a general readership word, so I think that's always been something I've kept in mind. And then I think I did go on this journey of asking every single person what resilience means to them. And I almost feel like I should just read the passage from Charles Lester, because I think when I talked to Charles, that was the final moment where like everything fell into place for me. But resilience to so many people for so long is this idea of, it's a measurement of how strong we are and how much we are able to bounce back from adversity. Katrina levels New Orleans, and we shall rebuild exactly what we lost in exactly the same place that we lost it. That was resilience. That is resilience still to a lot of people. The way the insurance market and the National Flood Insurance Program was traditionally structured also kind of measured resilience in this way. You lost your home to a wildfire, you get money back to build exactly what you lost in exactly the same place that you lost it. But then I go to like communities that you would define as like environmental justice communities, and I met this incredible woman up in Oakland, and she started inviting herself to a lot of these climate change planning meetings, and she's been such a powerful spokeswoman for her community. And she was like, what is this word resilience that everyone just talks about? Like, it's no big, it's so part of the conversation. And then, she looked up the word resilience in the dictionary, and she was like, yo, my community's been resilient from social change, economic change, history of redlining, pollution. Like, we have continued to be resilient to all of the crap that's been thrown at us. And so I was like, that is also a powerful way of thinking about resilience. Resilience is also the indigenous communities that have been erased largely from so many of these conversations, that have been siloed to these conversations of just the past, and to be still present and so critical to the future, and to be speaking the language still today. That is resilience too, the number of people who've told me that. And so ultimately, this question of what is resilience became this kind of exercise in, is it truly maintaining the status quo that is resilience, our ability to remain unchanged? And I think that this conversation with Charles, I think it's half a page reading I can do from the book, it made me realize that ultimately the journey of this book and the point of one of the core questions of this book is not what do we do about sea level rise, but what is our capacity for change and to embrace change, because we are all ultimately afraid of change. And so here, I'll just read a little bit of it. So the he here is Lester. He's been mulling over this word, resilience, that comes up so often with climate change. For those still thinking in terms of man versus nature, resilience means having the strength to rebuild in the same place after a catastrophe, to resume life as it was before. The standard way we talk about resilience is this ability to bounce back, Lester said. Resilience is often about making sure we are strong enough to not be changed, but what if we should change? More and more sociologists, economists, even engineers are now questioning who exactly benefits from preserving the world the way it is today. Whose wealth, whose property, whose history gets preserved by maintaining the status quo? We've seen increasing gentrification and disparities in wealth. We've seen the cost of housing in the coastal zone go through the roof. And we've seen an exposed, impoverished political system that in many cases is driven by power and vested interests, as opposed to larger interests of society and the community, he said. So in my mind, we need to figure out how to adapt, but it's so much deeper than that. He pulled out a paper written in 2020 by Brian H. Walker, a renowned ecologist in Australia who poses a broader way of thinking about resilience. Resilience includes knowing when an unwanted transformation is inevitable, Walker wrote, and instead deliberately transforming all or parts of the system such that the new system delivers what is valued and wanted. So as a first step, Lester reflected, I think we need to acknowledge and recognize and remember that social institutions are human-created artifacts. They're not rooted in some natural order. All of these debates that we're having along the property of the shoreline, that's really rooted in the original colonialism and the taking of the land by the sovereign, and then passing it from the Spanish government to the Mexican government to the US government, and establishing the property lines that we're now fighting about up and down the coast. Suing over a homeowner's right to a seawall, debating the costs of managed retreat, these disagreements delay the inevitable need for fundamental change. I'm going to flash forward a page. Adaptation ultimately is about choice. It's about choosing what to preserve, choosing what to let change, and choosing what to intentionally change in a new and reimagined way. To resist change is to miss out on opportunities to create a better future. To remain unchanged is to buy into the long-held myth that the world today is as good as it gets. To ignore this choice to mend our relationship with the land and with each other is to believe that the systems we're still holding on to, Systems built on social inequities, historical injustices, and the willful control of nature are the way that things should always be. So I think, this conversation with Charles made me realize that this sea level rise is an opportunity to kind of re-examine the systems that got us into the situation in the first place, and that a lot of it is not working. A lot of people have been left behind, and what is it that we're actually trying to preserve, and is that what we want to preserve? And so resilience ultimately is our, courage to ask these questions and to recognize that we do need to transform and that we can do it in a way that is intentional and mindful and together as a community.
Thank you. That was really important, and I'm glad you pulled that chapter out. Looks like one you've referenced before. But it was one of my favorites. So thank you. Yeah. As we wind down, a reminder, we've got question cards. If you've not turned them in yet, get them to want Nancy or Margaret here around. We will try to get to as many as possible. But a question to you on your next step. So, Rosanna, to you as an investigative reporter, and Gary, to you as a scientist, how do you maintain objectivity in your research and writing? Or do you? Rosanna, you've done a lot of research for this book. You've talked to lots of people throughout many communities. As a journalist, do you feel that you need to tell two sides to the story? And how do you decide what to report? And Gary, for you to mull over, you've studied places all over with shifting conditions associated with climate change. You're part of the team with the Ocean Protection Council developing guidance on sea level rise. As a scientist, do you ever feel compelled to advocate for a particular position? So Rosanna, you first. How do you decide what to do?
And you also said, how do you balance two sides? I wish there were only two sides to an issue. That would make my life a lot easier. A couple of thoughts here. So I can't speak for all journalists, but I will just say that I consider myself a old, younger journalist, and I think I am of a cohort of journalists who firmly believe that to promise a reader that a journalist is unbiased is not possible and not the right way to do it. I think, but we're all human, and I think to pretend that we don't have biases is just a disservice to everyone. And again, this is my own opinion as a journalist. But I think what I can promise the reader is that I did everything I could to be fair, to listen to all sides, and that I didn't just seek out, sources and information that validated a pre-existing notion, and that I am open-minded, and that my stories change through the journey of reporting out a story, and that happens to me all the time. I tell every young journalist, if you set out to write the story that you thought you were going to write, then you didn't do your job. My editor, who is also in the audience today, Martina, also told me, you're supposed to grow with your book. If you set out to write exactly the book that you proposed to do, then you didn't work hard enough to write that book. And so, what does it mean to promise fairness? And I've told this, Gary's probably heard me tell this story before. So the night before, I was actually a young reporter back then, and it was my first kind of bigger story, and I could not sleep. I called my editor at 10:30 p.m., and I'm freaking out, and he was just like, Rosanna, if, when the story runs tomorrow morning, if every single person quoted in that article hates you just a little bit, tells you, great story, but why did you have to talk to this person, or why did you quote this thing? And I don't really just, if they all nitpick something, that means you are fair. If everyone hates you just a little bit, fairness is just no one being happy with you. And I'm like, great, sign me up for this career. So, and I think that really stuck with me, and this was years ago. And I think in the course since then, I think that I have realized in my own process that the opposite end of that extreme is also possible. That the day when a big story runs, or when a book publishes, if everyone quoted in the book and everyone I spoke to felt heard, I think that also is a form of fairness. And so I think my own approach is to always make sure that every side of the issue, every person felt heard, even if they don't agree fully with everything else that was covered in my article or the book. And I think to take that one step further, I think that the longer I've been doing this, the more I've realized that it's not just sitting down and being like, okay, I'm about to write about this issue and check, check, check. Here are all the people at the table that I need to talk to. Here are all the sides. Did I talk to this side? Did I talk to this person? Did I talk to whatever? It's also kind of at one point after doing that, stepping way back and being like, okay, who is not at the table that should be at the table? You know, just because I've talked to every single side of like the folks who signed up to talk at public comments on an issue does not mean I've actually talked to everyone that should be talked to and to, you know, should be invited into this conversation. So I think a lot of the work, the hardest part of the work in this book and in the way I write and what I choose to write is to recognize, you know, who is missing from this conversation, who has been erased from this conversation. I think, you know, there are communities in this book that didn't, you know, are so constantly, you know, I talk to community leaders who are talking about pollution issues and how, you know, their kids, there's the rite of passage that like everyone just gets asthma by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade and how they just want to park in their community. Like they're not talking about climate change because they're too worried about jobs and all of these things. And it's my job to come into this community and not just be like, I want to talk about sea level rise with you and you're on a map that looks like it's going to flood in a couple of years, but to really help kind of open these conversations that are more open-ended and to help them to recognize that these are conversations that are intersecting with climate change. And also I think to value perspectives that aren't, you know, necessarily valued or centered in a lot of these conversations. So for me, fairness is not just talking to everyone that, you know, is at the table, but expanding that conversation even further. And it's not easy, and I end up talking to a lot of people, and I, you know, have not slept, I think, in many, many years. But yeah, and I feel like there's one more question that you had asked, but I hope that addresses what you were asking.
Absolutely. And Gary, do you ever want to say your opinion, or do you stick with the science only, or do you advocate for different things in your role?
Well, first I want to say it's an honor to be up here with Rosanna, who's really an amazing person, an amazing writer. And the first time we spoke together a couple of months ago with her book in Santa Cruz, as she said, you know, I really work a lot on my writing, but I'm not a very good speaker. And I went, oh. She's an amazing person, really. I'll just give a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a astrophysicist and a science communicator, and he says, the wonderful thing about science, it's true whether or not you believe it. This could go a long way on politics today, because there are facts and opinions, and anyway. So I guess the nice thing about being a scientist is, you know, we look at facts and data. We don't try to report that necessarily to the public, but, you know, what have we learned? What don't we know? And I think I try to be honest with what we know and what we don't know. And one of the reasons we do science is to learn more about, you know, how high is sea level rising, how fast, so forth. And so I would say I certainly have my own opinions. You may have gotten a little bit of that today. But I try to not let that cloud the science.
Great. I think you did it well. So I want to thank you both. We're running a bit longer, but I know we're still a bit flexible on our time if everybody else is. I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we really hope that this dialogue, hearing the historical context, the science, and personal observation, that we'll be able to change the narrative and write a new chapter for the California coast as well as Pacifica. So we're going to have a few questions if you want to stretch a bit. And Rosanna, before we do this, do you have a passage you'd like to read from your book to end, or do you feel the one with Charles Lester was enough for you right now?
I think that was good.
Okay.
Let's do questions.
All right. It was a good one. Okay. So we won't get to all of these, but let's see. And this kind of ties into that question of, you know, should managed retreat maybe be rebranded? The question is, I often use the phrase landward migration instead of managed retreat. What would you consider as a more productive way to characterize that concept? And you said that it's troubling to you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about it. So I'll just say that, you know, from a writer's perspective, I mean, no one likes to be managed, and retreat feels like failure. And, you know, in the American psyche, we don't retreat, we defend, and we hold the line. And so, I think that we just need, in the same way with resilience, and I also would say this with journalism students, like, whenever I speak in journalism classes, I'm like, I'll call on people, be like, define climate change. You know, what is climate change? And, you know, with managed retreat too, it's like these are terms that become so politicized and so, you know, open for interpretation depending on who is talking, that I think we just need to be more clear about what it is that we're actually talking about. And then I think, you know, the term itself, I remember talking to a community in the Monterey area, and they were like, managed retreat is just marching in a different direction. And I'm like, I like that too. But, so I think, you know, beyond the wording, I think we need to just get past the like managed retreat. Managed retreat feels like a slogan, and I think it's just really getting into the nitty gritty of what it actually means. And again, helping a community enter this long-term process of building towards something that is valued by the community. And just to remember that managed retreat in itself is not the goal. It's just one of many ways to get towards the actual goal of what a community actually wants. I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
I'm good with that.
Okay. So here's a great one as a follow-up. So you just brought up working with students. Gary, it's what you do every day. Rosanna, I believe you go back to your school and to other places. But it was commented on that, I won't take this personally, that the folks in the room are over 50, probably on average here. So how are you going out there and educating the younger generation, and what are you hearing from them as well about what their thoughts are of the consequences of what we're facing right now?
As a teacher, professor, and I've now had about 17,000 undergraduate students over the years, and I'd like to think I had some modest impact on their lives, but probably not at age 18, 19, 20, 21. There's just too many other diversions today, and I'm always amazed because when I started teaching, there was no cell phones and no laptops, and everybody came to class and was ready to learn. Now, everybody got a phone, and they kind of have to, or else they don't come to class. So I think in some ways they're sort of overwhelmed. In that first year or second year in college, by the time they're their third, their fourth year, they're further along in their career choices. But I think they're still away from home. You probably have kids of college age away from home the first time. Oh, it's like a mad dog in a meat house. I didn't say that. So I think it's challenging. I feel it's challenging, but on the other hand, it's why I have not retired. I'm now the longest serving faculty member, and I don't feel that old, but actually I am. How to keep them inspired and motivated and show them that there is a future, that they're going to live a lot longer through than we do. So trying to just keep that spark alive, you know. Don't stop believing.
It's actually really incredible how many times I'm out in the field covering like the California coast. Like I could literally be in Humboldt and someone will be like, oh yeah, I took Gary's class in blah, 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 blah year. So the number of Gary students that are out in the wild is pretty remarkable. A couple of thoughts here on just the younger generations that have really stuck with me. I think younger folks have a different relationship to property and ownership. Obviously the housing crisis and just how expensive everything is now, but this idea, very American notion of I'm gonna buy a house, you know, have a family and pass that house on for generations, like that notion doesn't stick with, I'm not running into that as much with the younger generation. And with that, I think it comes with like a greater freedom of like, some of, you know, this notion of owning property and all of the things, the concerns and worries and uncertainties that come with that in the face of climate change. And this lack of rootedness is something I also sense when I talk to younger folks, like what actually constitutes home? Is it actually grounded to the specific place or town and I think one of the things that has always really stuck with me about Pacifica actually is this sense of grounding and sense of place and sense of home. And, just going through the history of Pacifica and how all these hamlets banded together to make sure that Pacifica didn't get turned into a landfill for some other town on the other side of the valley. And just kind of this fight to create a sense of place, to maintain the sense of home. I feel that there's like less of that with younger folks, and I think some of it is just because of kind of the greater chaos in which we live today. But I think from out of that comes also this like really inspiring, renewed kind of connection to the collective commons. I feel like this idea of this land versus my land, being a guest of the land and sharing resources, like this notion of sharing and that we are all part of this broader collective. I get that from so many younger folks that I talk to, and I'm actually really encouraged by how that mindset, especially as they are now, leaving their PhD programs and entering kind of government and, all these forms of planning and really just getting into the field to help us navigate these really tough questions. I'm really curious how that's going to play out because, this kind of returned sense of what it means to value the commons and to not be so individualistic in the way we think about ownership has been really interesting to me.
But Gary, that should make you feel good that somehow they've been listening to you.
I want to know if anybody in the room took one of my classes. I had about 20 years ago, a student came up after my big oceanography class I've been doing for over 50 years and she said, my mom and my dad took your class. And then 5 years later, a young woman came up and said, my grandmother took your class. It's okay.
Oh, good. So you talked about the geologic process and that considering solutions is a social process. What you didn't mention was the impacts to marine habitat and marine environment as a result of any decisions. Should this be part of the conversation? Now, I think you did touch on the visioning and what do we value and protect. So how do we bring the bigger picture into the conversation, not just our human selves?
Yeah, I have two quick thoughts here, and I feel like I could talk about this forever, but I think I really appreciate this question because it's reminding me of something I should have said earlier to the sand renourishment question. I think that something that had been lost for a while in the earlier conversations about sand renourishment is that when you bring sand in to a beach, to widen the beach, to buffer the beach, to serve as again, to create more space between the land and ocean, it tends to create a very sterile environment. And I think, if you look at Santa Monica Beach, it's wide and sandy and flat, but there is no life there. And I think that is a conversation that I think has, really grown in momentum in a way that I think is really interesting. So I think just the revival of just paying attention to beach ecology is huge. I think, and then obviously marine life and kelp and the fact that a lot of people don't like kelp in Southern California, so we get rid of it before people see it. That's another whole conversation. And I had another thought, but I am blanking right now, so I will let Gary. Do you have any other thoughts on? Oh, I just remembered. I'm sorry. Go.
Don't lose it.
Oh, okay, sorry. It's really hard when I have so many different scattered thoughts. I think this might be one of my more controversial hot takes for the day, but I think that, for so long, the modern environmental movement that came of age in the 60s, the way we created some of these structures of saving one endangered species at a time has been, it was necessary when it was created, but I think ultimately I've been noticing this shift in the conservation sphere of rather than doing all of these things, creating all these plans and decisions set around saving one species, what does it mean to save the whole habitat or to revive the whole habitat? And conserving the stage and conserving the entire landscape is something that I'm noticing a lot more. And so it's not just about saving this one animal, but also what the animal eats, what eats the animals and the plants and all of the things. And I think that's a really interesting evolution of, I think, ultimately the same goal, but I think will create, given how much that conversation has taken hold, that will also shift in a lot of interesting ways how we protect the coast from an ecological standpoint going into the future. Okay, done with my thought.
No, just quickly, I think we clearly pay more attention to habitats and organisms than physical stuff like sand. It's inert. And we spend a lot of time today, and this got into wetlands and so forth, trying to save wetlands and protect them. But in fact, say around San Francisco Bay, as sea level rises, there's an edge around the whole bay of something developed. Anything we do is going to be temporary because the water is going to overpower that, overcome it, it's going to flood it. If we look back in geologic time, sea level rose 400 feet from 18,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago. Coral reefs, mangroves, everything survived. I think the systems are really pretty resilient. What has never had to deal with sea level rise before are people and cities. But the habitats have done pretty well. Certainly we've destroyed many and organisms are going extinct, but I'm less worried about them than us right now.
That's a great point, though, that, again, and why nature is so amazing, and we should be learning from her, because she's been doing this for a lot longer than we have. And I'm going to have to share with you, Rosanna, I was born in Santa Monica, so I have some great old photos of along the beach there and postcards of there when it was natural and rugged, and it was a habitat, not just groomed white sand and everything, so I love that too. So there's a question here that I'm going to actually just mention for folks who are here with the city council. Somebody was interested in knowing, how can volunteers work with the city on retreating? For example, if I'd like to move my house inland in anticipation of the future, who could I work with? What does this look like? Can we start talking about that? So that's not for you, that's for the community at large. And what is for you is your last final thoughts. A couple of questions that are here is, what should we be doing right now? What are the last things that you want to share with us? What can coastal cities do now in the near term as we're dealing with what to move forward? You know, should we be talking about a middle ground between armoring and managed retreat? Should we be moving infrastructure? Should we be closing roads? Is there something that you see, and it doesn't have to be any of these prescribed suggestions here, but what would you suggest from who you've spoken to and what you know about the coast scientifically that would be a good step for Pacifica right now?
Well, one, I think, is acknowledging the past, and our history discussion sort of showed what's happened to this area over the years. We can't turn that back. We can't deny it, so we understand, wow, we have built out on the beach. The other is acknowledging, I think, that sea level's rising, but we're also having these extreme events like we've had this winter and the winter before. And the third, I think, is coming together, which I think you've done many times in Pacifica, whether it's having other people talk or at least everybody in a format to listen to one another and say, okay, what are the pluses and minuses, both short-term and long-term. We might want to do something within 10 years, and then we have to think a little further beyond that. What are the steps or the triggers that say, okay, we can no longer save X, so what's our next step?
Last word.
Oh, God. I want to answer this question in so many different ways. I think the first thought that popped into my head is something that I've been hearing from a lot of folks kind of in the adaptation space, like people who've studied it academically, planners who've talked to me off the record on stuff, and just like, you know, folks who have been really in the trenches of the actual logistics of like how do we go from where we are now to even the next incremental step. And I think just the question I will pose to everyone here, and I encourage you to share it, like talk about this with your neighbors too, is just kind of what is the actual purpose of government? And is it to protect property values? Is it to, is it to protect, public safety? Is it to do the most cost-benefit analyses, or is it to facilitate these conversations? Like what is it that you actually want from your government, and like to be clear about that? Because I think that, in communities, especially where, like Pacifica, where folks are extremely engaged from all sides of the issue, I think we're projecting these expectations of government in a way that, I think that there just needs to be kind of a broader philosophical reflection on what the actual, what is the point of government, what is the role of government? And I know that's a very heady philosophical question, but I think once you start, that it's a fun thought, fun is not the right word, it's an interesting thought exercise, and I think that might sharpen some of the policy questions that can be posed in a different way going forward. And I think the other thing I just want, I think maybe as like to leave folks with is just, this is a really fraught issue. I'm not, gonna deny that, and I think everyone in the room knows this too. But I think the thing that most surprised me in the process of working on this book is just how much we all have in common. And I really ultimately see that like as my duty to help people connect the dots. But like every person I talk to on all sides of the issue, this person hates this person is like, yelled at whatever person, and like, but they all, and they think they disagree with each other, and they're all, getting angry in their silos, but ultimately everyone cares so much. Everyone has at least one story about what drew them to the ocean, and like even the person that one other person told me, oh, this person is so extreme and is not to be messed with. I'm walking with this person, and this person is picking up trash as we're talking because this person also cares about the coast. And like we all want, we want a better future for our community. And I think there was just something so powerful, especially in Pacifica, how everyone chose to live here and everyone really loves being here. And I think that level of care has translated in different intense ways. And I just think, and it's not just in Pacifica, I am just so blown away by the number of people who really care about the ocean and have a deep kinship to the ocean. I don't want folks to lose sight of that. And I think that, a lot of folks have said when they read my book, they like really feel this love for the coast. And I think that love comes from me absorbing everyone's love for the coast and finding so many different ways to translate that into words. So yeah, I think that conversations are important. And I think, back to Naomi Klein's point that like we need to validate people's emotions and to understand why people feel certain ways. I think that might be, that level of empathy, I think, could also shift the conversation in a way that, would be really meaningful.
Wow, so much to think about. We can hang out together. You can continue the conversation. I want to thank Dr. Gary Griggs for being here today, sharing his insight. Rosanna Xia for her beautiful book, California Against the Sea. And don't forget the second part of that title, Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline that we can all create together. So books in the back, Rosanna will be signing back there. And I also have just some little thank you bags for you guys for being here today. But there is food in the back as well. And thank you so much. Continue to enjoy this conversation with each other. And thank you again for being here.